The United States backed an invasion of Rwanda on October 1st, 1990 by a Ugandan army led by US-trained killers and supported their attack on Rwanda for 3.5 years. People fled the invaders, creating a huge refugee crisis, ruined agriculture, wrecked economy, and a shattered society. The US and the West armed the war makers and applied additional pressure through the World Bank, the IMF, and USAID. And among the results was increased hostility between Hutus and Tutsis. Eventually, the government would topple. First would come the mass slaughter known as the Rwandan genocide, and before that would come the murder of 2 presidents. At that point, in April 1994, Rwanda was in chaos, almost on the level of post-liberation Iraq or Libya. The US-backed government, post-slaughter, took war into the Congo, where 6 million people have since been killed. And we're taught that Rwanda is a case where more violence was needed, but where the so-called international community, which consists of representatives of the 1% of about 8% of humanity, supposedly failed to act. Never again is the shout we hear about Rwanda and about World War II understood as a war that should have been and a war that righteously was. It's stunning how many people go back 73 years to find an example they support of what has been our top public investment ever since. But was the good war actually good? It is widely accepted that World War I was unnecessary, yet without World War I, its sequel is unimaginable. Ending World War I with punishment of an entire nation rather than of the war makers was understood by wise observers at the time to make World War II very likely. The arms race between the 2 world wars was widely and correctly understood to be making the Second War more likely. US and other Western corporations profited by enriching and arming dangerous governments in Germany and Japan, which also had the support of Western governments between the wars. The United States had tutored Japan in imperialism and then provoked it through territorial expansion, economic sanctions, and assistance to the Chinese military. Winston Churchill obtained a secret commitment from US President Franklin Roosevelt to bring the United States into the war. The US government expected the Japanese attack, took numerous actions it knew were likely to provoke it, and prior to the attack, ordered its navy to war with Japan, instituted a draft, collected the names of Japanese Americans, and ignored peace activists marching in the streets for years against the long build-up to a war with Japan. Japanese Prime Minister Fumimaro Konoye proposed talks with the United States in July 1941, which Roosevelt rejected. President Roosevelt lied to the U.S. public about Nazi attacks on ships and plans to take over the Americas in an effort to win support for entering the war. President Roosevelt and the U.S. government blocked efforts to allow Jewish refugees into the United States or elsewhere. Facts about Nazi crimes in concentration camps were available but played no part in war propaganda until the war was over. Wise voices predicted accurately that continuing the war would mean the escalation of those crimes. After gaining air superiority, the Allies declined to raid the camps or bomb the railway lines to them. No crimes, apart from the war itself, by any nation remotely matched in scale the death and destruction of the war itself. The U.S. military and government knew that Japan would surrender without the dropping of nuclear bombs on Japanese cities, but dropped them anyway. The U.S. military put numerous Japanese and German war criminals on its staff following the war. U.S. doctors engaging in human experimentation during and after World War II widely viewed the Nuremberg Code as applicable only to Germans. Nonviolent resistance to Nazism in Denmark, Sweden, the Netherlands, and even in Berlin, poorly planned and developed though it was in that day and age, showed remarkable potential. World War II gave the world wars in which civilians are the primary victims and a permanent, massive U.S. military aggressively present around the globe. It takes 2 sides to wage a war between wealthy nations. The crimes of one side don't excuse the crimes of the other. The point of recognizing them is to avoid their repetition. Japan's president, with U.S. support, hopes to remove peace from Japan's constitution. The U.S. government is backing a coup in Ukraine that includes Nazis among its leaders. We are handicapped if we don't know we've been here before. If we only ever say never again after horrors rather than before them, then the life expectancy of our species shrinks. World War II became the good war in contrast to Vietnam, or what the Vietnamese called the American War. Afghanistan became a good war in contrast to Iraq. But we don't view cases of slavery or child abuse or rape as good because other cases are worse. Afghanistan was and is as illegal and immoral and counterproductive on its own despicable terms as Iraq. Decades of horrible policies preceded the latest assault, just as with Iraq. Allies were made enemies and demonized, just as in Iraq. The bulk of the population that just wants to live in peace was deemed essentially valueless, just as in Iraq. There was no UN authorization, just as in Iraq, and every effort was made to avoid any peaceful resolution, just as with Iraq. A group of mostly Saudi hijackers had spent time in a number of nations and US states. The Taliban government was willing to turn Osama bin Laden over to a neutral country to be put on trial. The Taliban was not itself Al-Qaeda, and the vast majority of the people of Afghanistan not only did not support 9/11, but have not heard of it. Over a dozen years into this war, the idea to keep 5,000 troops there for another 10 years and beyond is being reported not as a decision to keep troops there, but as a decision to keep fewer than 10,000 troops there. As if 10,000 were just the norm. In fact, the U.S. has some million troops in 175 nations. My math is not very good, but I'd say 5,714 is the norm. 3 years ago, the White House claimed that Libyan President Muammar Gaddafi, conveniently, as the head of a government on a Pentagon list of governments to be overthrown, had threatened to massacre the people of Benghazi with no mercy. But the New York Times reported that Gaddafi's threat was directed at rebel fighters, not civilians, and that Gaddafi promised amnesty for those who throw their weapons away. Gaddafi also offered to allow rebel fighters to escape to Egypt if they preferred not to fight to the death. Yet President Obama warned of imminent genocide. The result of NATO joining the war was almost certainly more killing, not less. It certainly extended a war that looked likely to end soon with a victory for Gaddafi.